Okay, dystopia is for sure one trajectory, but it's not the only one.
Welcome back to the podcast called Heja Framtiden, a Swedish podcast on the future. My name is Christian von Essen. Today I'm at United Spaces in Stockholm at Torsgatan at an event called Speculative Futures. I'm sitting here with Johanna Hoffman from the US. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Urbanist, researcher and writer, and you recently wrote a book called Speculative Futures, Design Approaches to Navigate Change, Foster Resilience and Co-Create the Cities We Need. Tell me a bit about your background. You've been through several different universities and worked as a researcher, and you also, are you co-founder of the agency DFA?
Yes. I am the co-founder of Design for Adaptation, which is the acronym DFA. And I've also worked as a writer and a researcher pretty much since the age of 18. So it's been now like 2 decades. And it's evolved in different ways. I think at first it was very much about trying to understand what was happening with sea level rise and climate change. I worked as a coral reef researcher on a boat in Polynesia for a year when I was 18. So that was kind of like when this work started for me, and I started to understand, sea level rise and coral bleaching and global hotspots are very much a thing. And then from there it really went on to working in coastal management, doing that at different research stations and positions. And then over time, I kind of really got depressed because tracking coral decline is tragic. And looking at people being displaced by sea level rise is so hard. And I really wanted to find a way to be more proactive rather than documenting these declines in a more logistical way. And so I went back to school for a degree in planning and design. And for a while, that seemed like a helpful trajectory. And when I got into the professional world, I quickly realized, doing projects that don't do more harm, that's quite hard to do. And that's not the majority of the way that a lot of these projects are executed. So what's a way for me to both try and find those projects and also to assuage my soul while I work on some not so great projects because I need to pay my student debt bills? I started to do installations that I later realized were speculative futures installations. I started to understand, lots of other people do this work. This isn't something that I just made up. And through that, I started to understand that I was part of a much bigger community, which was both so nourishing and fulfilling on a personal level and also really amazing on a professional level to understand there are lots of people who have done this for a really long time. So that was an invitation to start to understand what I could offer in that particular space.
Wow. And maybe we should define speculative futures and speculative design. You mentioned in the introduction to your book, I just started listening to it, that it's a redundant phrase actually because everything is speculative in its nature. But how do you define the speculative aspect of it?
I define the term, and thank you for acknowledging that forward to my book, which is very much addressing the fact that the phrase is redundant. I use the phrase because it's both what a lot of people use to articulate what these particular sorts of tools are, but also to acknowledge the fact that if we don't call future speculative, it does encourage a certain attitude where the status quo is just going to continue. So I think giving it that disclaimer, for some people it makes something about finance. Whenever I talk to my dad about what I do, he's like, are you talking about money and investment? And for others, it's an invitation to think about future trajectories in an alternative way, which I think is the fundamental aspect of what this particular kind of work is all about. So when I define it for people, it's an array of design and storytelling tools to articulate high-resolution visions of what the future can be. And the goal is really to collapse that distance between tomorrow and today to start to explore what tomorrow might become so that it can inform the decisions that we make in the present moment so that we can move towards those trajectories of tomorrow that we hopefully might prefer.
There's often a science fiction element involved. and there's playfulness involved and sort of imagination. Is it a way to get away from the sort of naysayers that always rush in to say that this is not viable, this will never happen?
I think it's just a forum for having conversation that has a little bit more of the understanding that the future is not guaranteed. So I think it's not about saying like naysayers are wrong. There is obviously a chance that the status quo conditions could continue. That's for sure one possible future. It's also not the only one. And I think the whole point of investing in speculative futures and exploring different ways of working with the future is appreciating that it's a possibility space. That's really the whole point. Why else would you do it? And I think with people who really invest in this work on both a personal and a professional level are people who find ways of massaging that space between fantasy and reality. Can we really celebrate it? And what I mean by celebration is iterating on it. The future is not a given. It's a process. It's a path. So what does it mean to work on what that path could be? How do you build it? How do you craft it? How do you maybe remake it entirely? How do you envision how it might lead to a completely different trajectory? And there are tools for doing that.
Because now we're in a sort of phase of where we need a huge transformation in many ways. And many people say that we suffer from a lack of imagination. We are good at finding solutions, but we're terrible at actually describing and envisioning what these solutions could become in the future. So is this a way of visualizing also what a future could look like?
There are tools for doing that with. There's no one way to do that, and speculative futures come in an array of types. So like you say, science fiction is one of them, specifically science fiction prototyping. So using the science fiction space as a way to prototype different systems, interventions, tools, and to look at them within the context of how they might impact wider society, individuals, etc. There are other forms. You can make objects from the future. People call this design fiction. That can be a way of really feeling into not just what it might be like on a conceptual level, but like what's a coffee cup like if I'm living in 2080? Does it look the same? How do I drink my coffee? So trying to get really tangible and very specific is a way of helping us envision what the future can be. How you articulate what those visions are, you can write a story, you can sing a song, you can have a conversation with your friend, you can draw a picture if you like. There are a bunch of avenues for creative expression that humans have been doing since forever. Think about the things that you used to do when you were playing with your friends and you were creating, a world where maybe you couldn't touch the ground because it was filled with lava. You had to jump from an object, on the floor, a couch to a pillow to a chair. Like, you made an entire world if you played that game, and you didn't use very much to do it with. So there are a bunch of different ways of articulating these futures that we want that sometimes can be very expensive and use very sophisticated tools, virtual reality, etc. Or we can use very simple tools, and how you use them and then how you see what is depicted as the product of how you use them is really, I think, something that is highly individual, and it's most powerful when it really comes from an individual and authentic place.
And you worked with this in practice with communities across the world. Can you give us an example of how this could look like in practice?
It can look like so many different things, but sometimes it's about getting people from a particular group together to envision what long-term climate change planning might look like. And sometimes when we think about climate change, it is about thinking about the near term, 10 years, but it can be really powerful to think about it in a longer-term context. What does that maybe look like in 80 years? Because let's face it, things are changing a lot more rapidly than we've thought in the past few decades. Sometimes it's worth looking at the longer-term time frame, not just to understand how we might set ourselves up and our grandchildren up for a life that hopefully is more beautiful, but maybe by doing that longer-term prep, you might help yourself because the unexpected could potentially very much occur. So what does that look like? Really trying to take people through a process where we feel into the future together, into that time frame. Try to make it as personal as possible. There are a bunch of different ways of doing this. And then start to write like a very detailed science fiction story of what that world is. What are the challenges? What are some of the aspects that might be curious? And then use that in order to inform takeaways. what is a particular vision, what are problems, refine and iterate on what that future might be. It doesn't have to be the first version that comes out. Most fiction is not the first version. It's oftentimes an iterative process. Most people who work in creative fields know this. It's not your first thing. So how to use that possibility space, again, as a way to say, like, we tested it out. What does it look like in this other avenue? How does this alternative trajectory start to unfold? And then if there is a particular future that the people assembled start to kind of coalesce on, if there are common themes, etc., finding, okay, what is a story space that has a lot of these crossover pieces in it? And then use that backcasting process that so many people in the futures and planning spaces do to say, okay, if we're moving back to the present moment, what are different initiatives that could be developed, explored at different moments to start to potentially move towards that future? Or how does it inform different initiatives that are already taking place today?
What could be some practical issues facing cities of the future? I mean, climate change is obviously one where you need to prepare and be adaptive to flooding and droughts and heat waves, an elderly population perhaps, inequality. What kind of clients are you working with in this space?
It's a different range. Sometimes it's a very small community group. Sometimes it's a city manager. Sometimes it's a private organization. So different scales of people and individuals and clients who sometimes have very different ideas about what they want to work on. But what I try and make very clear is that these tools are like not a silver bullet, and try to really find people who want to engage in a process over time.
And bring people from the community also into the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, like how you define what a community is also something that is not the same from one place to another. What scales of community are we talking about? What particular scales of impact are we talking about as well? If you're talking about a particular group, they might create a product or provide a service, and that could maybe affect a lot of different people. And would you consider all of the people that it affects to be part of the community? So I think also when doing this work, what's also really necessary is to start to break down the ways that we define things like the community, and maybe also ask what communities are we talking about? I think putting a plural on that is pretty necessary, because even in one particular community from the outside, if it seems like a singular one, there can be so much diversity and richness in terms of how people see the world, the values that they hold, the beliefs that they cling to, that it's really necessary to see the richness that is there and to work with it accordingly.
You had a nice example from the United Arab Emirates where you presented a visualization of the future. Can you just elaborate a bit on that?
So this was a project by the studio Superflex, who, if your listeners are not familiar with, it's an amazing studio that's been in practice for now long over a decade, do amazing work. This was a project called the Future Energy Lab, and it was done in order to inform the country's long-term energy strategy policy up to 2050. And so Superflex worked with a few other organizations, but they were contracted by the government of the UAE to identify 5 different scenarios of how energy development could progress in the country, and then developed different speculative futures interventions, mostly experiential futures, which is trying to make a very experiential version of how we might connect with a future possibility. They made role-playing games, an energy simulator, different interventions to create a space where people, and these were all pretty high-level decision makers in the government, so head of cabinet, different powerful people, would be engaging with what these different futures could bring. So in one of them, they made air sample that you could smell that would show you a vision. Well, not a vision. It was literally you could smell the air that would occur if current fossil fuel rates emissions continued. And it was foul smelling. It was bad. But it was also based on research of literally what might happen if current fuel rates are used moving forward. And decision makers had some very emotional responses. And I think that's really some of the power that speculative futures tools can bring. They invite us to bring our whole human selves into decision-making processes rather than to focus on numbers and different sorts of strategic objectives as being the way that we make our choices, because we're humans. How do we want to live our human lives? Having some of these interventions are real invitations and real opportunities to engage with the future from this very human place.
And you also saw that they actually changed their strategy after this project.
Well, we don't know. We
not
don't know.
necessarily because of it, but
Yeah,
still.
there's no way to say for sure that that was the deciding factor in how the UAE was going to decide how to invest in different forms of energy moving forward. But decision makers participated in that project. All of the key ones were all involved. They had all gone through that future energy lab. So I don't think it's proof, but I think that it's an indicator that these things can, when they are funded well, when they are enveloped in a process, and when they're done with people who are willing and interested. The UAE has been interested in futures work for a long time. They have a whole museum dedicated to it. They've been doing futures-oriented issues, and they also know that fossil fuel is limited. They're not stupid. They've been aware of this for a very long time. So they've been actively investigating different avenues for moving forward. So it's not as if this speculative futures intervention was the thing that changed everybody's mind. It was, however, I think, done in a context where when people are open and receptive, when the process is cultivated in a way where it can have some real deliverable connections and outcomes that are planned out and meaningful. And when they have very well funded, because the UAE is a rich country at this point, when those things are in place, I think the effect of speculative futures interventions can be very potent.
I usually ask my guests, what is your best tip for making the world a better place in the future?
Oh man, my best tip. I don't know if I have the best one, but the one that's coming to mind at the moment is to really give ourselves space to imagine and then to discuss those imaginations, what comes out of them with other people, and to maybe practice and enjoy doing them with others. Because I can think so often, what do I want to do tomorrow? Or where do I want to be in 5 to 10 years? I'm a person who loves to do that process. A lot of people, I think, do that process individually, but we don't always do them together. So whether it's, with a beloved friend, or if you're part of a family unit, perhaps that, but then practicing maybe even doing it across bigger groups. If you're part of a community that has some sort of common interest, you meet on a daily basis or maybe a monthly or a yearly basis, try and do it there potentially. I think the more that we can get used to imagining how we want to grow together, the more that these aspects of resilience that can unfold through the future visioning process and the trust that can be built while doing it can go exponentially. And I think that's really what it takes to make the world a better place.
Nice. Do you have any good reading tip or podcast tip?
Right now, I'm reading a couple of different books that I love. I've been rereading Braiding Sweetgrass a lot, so I'll just throw that one out there. If your listeners don't know it, it's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Fantastic book.
Do you think there's a problem that we are so drawn towards dystopian fiction?
I don't think inherently dystopian fiction is a problem on its own. I think it's a really helpful tool, again, for thinking through potential ramifications of trajectories that we notice around us. And that's important to do. I think when it's the dominant sort of story that's told about where futures can unfold, that's when it becomes a problem. Because if that's all of the material that we have with which to envision possible futures, we don't have as much material that can help remind us that, okay, dystopia is for sure one trajectory, but it's not the only one. So I think widening that breadth to include, explore, and celebrate other visions, of which there are not as many by any means. And so I'll just add some other authors. I think Ursula K. Le Guin, she's, dead now. She was writing a lot of stuff in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but amazing articulation of more nuanced, not dystopian, not utopian. She's all about that middle ground, protopian, uptopian.
Do you call yourself a future optimist?
I would call myself a pessimistic optimist. Like, my approach, my fundamental personal belief, and I don't advocate for anybody else to take this if it doesn't resonate for them, is that, things might get a lot worse. They also might get a lot better. I don't know which one is going to happen. I definitely have my days of deep sadness. But I also have my days of being truly amazed at the wonder of humans and what we're capable of and how we can treat each other. It's both. So I just know where I would like to put my energy. I would like to focus on how, in my own small way, I might be able to help others, find others, work with others who also want to explore what a more positive trajectory could look like. We might fail. I'm very much aware of that. but I'd rather try than not try.
Very good. Who do you think I should interview?
If you haven't already talked to her, I do think Anub Jain with Superflex is remarkable and amazing. She works with somebody who's here tonight, so that could be, a good connection. There's a lot of people, and I'm happy to give you a list. Because in this moment right now, the ones who are coming to mind are the ones who I've written about the most, and that's, not the only ones, but they're the ones that I've spent the most time with.
Great. Thank you so much, Johanna Hoffman, for joining Heja Framtiden.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And the book is called Speculative Futures and is out now. And I found it on Audible as an audiobook, so that's a tip. How can we find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Johanna Hoffman. You can find me on Instagram, Johanna E. Hoffman. You can find me at my website, johannahoffman.com. Yeah, come connect.
Great. Thank you so much to United Spaces for hosting this event, and Planeton, Speculative Futures, Stockholm section, and the Network for Foresight here in Stockholm. My name is Christian von Essen. Thank you so much for listening. Hejaframtiden.se for more information about this podcast and my other projects.